It was supposed to be an ordinary day at Apalachee High School in Winder, Georgia. Students were attending their regular classes, teachers were going through their lessons, and the school buzzed with the usual energy of a busy campus. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but as the day unfolded, something unimaginable was about to happen that would change the town of Winder forever. On that fateful day, 14-year-old Colt Gray walked into the school, blending in with the rest of the students. But what no one knew was that he wasn't carrying just his books or notebooks in his bag. Hidden inside was a weapon, an AR-15 style rifle capable of immense destruction. What followed was one of the deadliest school shootings in Georgia's history. In just a few minutes, Colt unleashed a horrific rampage, killing 2 students and 2 beloved teachers. 9 other individuals, some of them just children, were wounded in the chaos. The hallways of Apalachee High School, once filled with laughter and learning, were now filled with fear, confusion, and devastation. Law enforcement quickly responded, and Colt was apprehended without further incident. The school was evacuated, and parents rushed to pick up their children, terrified of the news they were hearing. But the damage had already been done, and the small community of Winder was left to grapple with an unthinkable tragedy. In this video, we're going to dive deep into the story behind the Georgia school shooter, Colt Gray. While most people focus on the devastating events of that day, we'll be examining what led up to it, the role his family played, and why this tragedy could have been prevented. This is a story that goes beyond just another school shooting headline. It's about missed opportunities, warning signs, and how the system failed the victims. The gun Colt Gray used in the shooting was an AR-15 style rifle, a weapon commonly seen in mass shootings across the United States. It's a semi-automatic rifle that fires high-velocity rounds, capable of inflicting catastrophic damage to the human body. This type of gun was designed for war zones, not schools. Yet in recent years, it's become the weapon of choice for those committing mass shootings, and the results are always devastating. Now, most people might assume that Colt somehow stole or illegally obtained the gun. After all, how could a 14-year-old get his hands on such a deadly weapon? But what many people don't realize is that the AR-15 wasn't something Colt found by accident. It was a Christmas gift from his own father, Colin Gray. That's right, just months before the shooting, Colt's father gave him this weapon as a present, despite knowing that his son had shown signs of violent behavior. It's even more shocking when you learn that, only 7 months before the attack, the FBI had received a tip about Colt. He had been making online threats about committing a school shooting, and law enforcement had already spoken to both Colt and his father. In May of 2023, Colt posted disturbing messages on Discord, a social media platform popular with gamers and young people. These messages hinted at his desire to commit violence at his school. Someone saw these posts and reported them to the authorities. The FBI traced the threats back to Colt, and they paid him and his father a visit. During that visit, Colt's father reassured the police that his son didn't have access to any weapons. But just a few months later, in a deeply misguided decision, Colin Gray gifted his son the AR-15 that would later be used in the attack. The gift was more than just a present, it was a sign of irresponsibility, and it demonstrated how blind some parents can be to the warning signs their children exhibit. In the state of Georgia, there are very few laws regulating the ownership of rifles like the AR-15. While there are strict rules regarding the purchase of handguns by minors, rifles and shotguns are another story. There's no minimum age for owning these weapons, and no legal requirement to keep them locked away from children. In fact, parents aren't even required to secure their firearms from minors, which means guns like Colt's AR-15 can easily end up in the hands of a child without breaking any laws. This raises a critical question: should Colt's father, Colin, bear responsibility for what happened? Was he negligent in giving his son access to such a deadly weapon, especially after being warned by the authorities about Colt's violent tendencies? Colin Gray's decision to give his son an AR-15 has now become a central focus of the legal fallout from the tragedy. Many people argue that he should face severe consequences for his actions. After all, he knowingly provided a firearm to a child who had already been flagged for making violent threats. But holding parents accountable for their children's actions is a legal and ethical gray area, especially when it comes to mass shootings. In the case of Colin Gray, prosecutors aren't holding back. He's been charged with second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and cruelty to children. These are serious charges, and they reflect the growing trend in the U.S. to hold parents accountable for failing to properly supervise their children when it comes to guns. This case is reminiscent of another tragic school shooting, the Oxford High School shooting in Michigan. In that case, the shooter's parents, James and Jennifer Crumbley, were charged with manslaughter because they bought a gun for their son, despite numerous warning signs that he was planning something violent. The Crumbleys ignored their son's cries for help, and when he finally carried out the attack, the law stepped in to hold them accountable. Colin Gray now faces a similar situation. The argument here is clear: as a gun owner and a parent, he had a responsibility to ensure that his son didn't have access to firearms, especially after law enforcement had already questioned them about Colt's behavior. But Colin failed in that responsibility, and as a result, innocent lives were lost. One of the key factors in Colin's case is the timeline of events leading up to the shooting. After the FBI visit in May 2023, many assumed that Colt was no longer a threat. The authorities didn't arrest him or take any further action because, at the time, there wasn't enough evidence to suggest that he was planning an immediate attack. But the situation changed when Colin gave his son the AR-15. Despite knowing the risks, Colin allowed his son to possess a weapon that should never have been in his hands. Some legal experts argue that parents like Colin Gray need to be held accountable to send a message to other gun owners. Owning a gun comes with responsibilities, and one of the most important is ensuring that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. In this case, the wrong hands were those of a 14-year-old boy with a history of making violent threats. But there's another layer to this story. The FBI's role in the events leading up to the shooting has also been called into question. When they received the tip about Colt's threats, they questioned both him and his father, but ultimately they didn't take further action. Some argue that the FBI missed an opportunity to prevent the tragedy by not taking more decisive steps at the time. Could more have been done to stop Colt before the shooting ever happened? Was there enough evidence at the time to warrant taking his online threats more seriously? These are difficult questions to answer, but they highlight the complexity of dealing with potential threats in the digital age. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, the town of Winder was in shock. This close-knit community had never experienced anything like this before. Apalachee High School, which had been a place of learning and growth for so many, was now the site of a deadly tragedy that no one would ever forget. The victims of the shooting were more than just names in a news headline. They were beloved members of the community, and their loss sent ripples of grief throughout Winder. Two students, Mason Schermerhorn and Christian Angelo, were among those who lost their lives. They were just teenagers, full of life and potential, but their futures were stolen in an instant. The two teachers who were killed, Christina Iremi and Richard Aspinwall, were pillars of the school. They had dedicated their lives to helping young people, shaping their futures, and making a difference in their students' lives. Christina was known for her kindness and her ability to connect with students on a personal level. Richard was respected for his dedication to teaching and his ability to inspire those around him. In the days following the shooting, the town came together in a series of vigils and memorials. Candles were lit, prayers were said, and tears were shed as the community mourned the loss of these 4 lives. But even as they grieved, there was an overwhelming sense of confusion and disbelief. How could something like this happen here? How could a 14-year-old boy be capable of such violence? For the students who survived, the trauma of that day would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Many of them described the chaos and fear they felt as the shooting unfolded. One student, Lila Coker, was shot in the leg while running from the shooter. Her life, like so many others, was forever changed in an instant. The school itself remained closed for weeks as the investigation continued. When classes finally resumed, the atmosphere was different. There was an increased police presence, and new security measures were put in place. But for many students and teachers, the feeling of safety they once had was gone. The impact of the shooting extended beyond just the school and the immediate victims. It affected the entire town of Winder, leaving a permanent scar on the community. Parents became more fearful, constantly worrying about their children's safety. Students who had once felt secure in their school now felt a sense of dread every time they walked through its doors. As the dust settled and the investigations into the shooting at Apalachee High School continued, one haunting question remained on everyone's minds: could this tragedy have been prevented? For many in the community, the answer seemed to be a painful yes. There were multiple warning signs leading up to the day of the shooting, starting with Colt Gray's disturbing online behavior. Months before the attack, he had made alarming threats on social media, talking about wanting to harm people at his school. This wasn't just some idle teenage post. These were serious threats that alarmed those who saw them enough to notify the FBI. When law enforcement got involved and questioned Colt and his father, it seemed like an opportunity to intervene and prevent something terrible from happening. But that chance was missed. The FBI didn't find enough evidence to pursue Colt further after their initial interview. They accepted his father's assurance that Colt had no access to firearms, which turned out to be tragically false. It wasn't long after that Colin Gray gave his son the AR-15 as a gift, completely ignoring the fact that his child had already shown violent tendencies. This catastrophic decision would set the stage for the events that unfolded at Apalachee High School. There were also signs within the school itself. According to some of Colt's classmates, he had been acting differently in the weeks leading up to the attack. He had become more withdrawn, making cryptic comments about violence and death. But none of these warning signs were ever reported to school officials or authorities. In a world where school shootings are sadly becoming more frequent, it raises the question of whether educators and students are trained enough to recognize these red flags. The school security measures were also called into question. How did Colt manage to bring such a large weapon into the building without anyone noticing? Were there enough safeguards in place to prevent such a thing from happening? Unfortunately, it seemed like the answer was no. As investigators continued to piece together what happened, one thing became clear: this was a tragedy that could have been avoided. There were too many missed opportunities to stop Colt before he took innocent lives. The system, both the legal system and the school system, failed to protect the victims, and as a result, 4 people lost their lives, and many more were left with physical and emotional scars. In the wake of the shooting, there were calls for stricter gun control laws in Georgia, particularly concerning the ownership of weapons by minors. Advocates pushed for legislation that would make it illegal for parents to give their children access to firearms without proper safeguards in place. They also called for better mental health screenings and interventions for young people who show signs of violent behavior. But the issue of gun control remains a deeply polarizing one in the United States, particularly in states like Georgia, where gun ownership is seen as a fundamental right. While some were eager to see new laws passed to prevent future tragedies, others argued that the focus should be on improving mental health resources and ensuring that parents are held accountable for their children's actions. For the families of the victims, these debates were frustrating and painful. No amount of legislation or blame shifting would bring back their loved ones. All they wanted was justice for those who had been taken from them too soon. One important lesson that emerged from the tragedy was the need for better communication between law enforcement, schools, and families. In Colt's case, there were multiple systems that should have worked together to prevent the shooting, but instead, they operated in isolation. If the FBI had followed up more aggressively after the initial tip-off, or if the school had been more aware of Colt's behavior, or if his father had taken more responsibility, things might have turned out differently. This tragedy also shined a light on the crucial role of parents in preventing gun violence. While the focus is often on the shooters themselves, many times there is a family member or guardian who had the power to stop the violence before it started. In this case, that person was Colin Gray. By giving his son access to a weapon capable of mass destruction, despite knowing about his son's troubling behavior, Colin became a part of the chain of events that led to the deaths of 4 people. And now he's facing the legal consequences of that decision. The Georgia school shooting is a heartbreaking reminder of how fragile life can be and how easily preventable tragedies can spiral out of control when warning signs are ignored. For the people of Winder, the pain of that day will never fully go away. But perhaps, by understanding what went wrong and holding those responsible accountable, future tragedies can be avoided. The story of Colt Gray and the Georgia school shooting is one of heartbreak, missed opportunities, and a system that failed to protect its most vulnerable. As the town of Winder continues to heal, it's clear that changes need to be made not just in how we handle potential threats, but in how we approach gun ownership and mental health. Stricter gun laws, better mental health resources, and more parental accountability are all critical steps in preventing future tragedies like this one. But it's also about creating a culture where people feel empowered to speak up when they see something wrong, whether it's a student acting suspiciously, a parent making a dangerous decision, or a system that isn't working as it should. The Georgia school shooting may have taken the lives of 4 innocent people, but it also left behind a powerful message: we must do better. For the sake of the victims, their families, and all the children who deserve to feel safe in their schools, we must work together to ensure that this kind of tragedy never happens again.